Police examined this property more than once, yet at first, nothing about it appeared out of the ordinary. On a typical weekday morning in East London, the area followed a familiar rhythm. Commuters moved steadily toward nearby underground stations, cafes opened their shutters, delivery vans paused briefly before continuing on their routes. The buildings themselves gave little away. Modern apartment blocks mixed with older commercial properties, each blending into the background of a city accustomed to constant movement. From the outside, one particular flat was indistinguishable from dozens of others in the same development. Lights switched on and off at expected hours, waste was collected on schedule. Residents came and went without drawing attention. Records later indicated that the property had passed routine checks more than once, each time raising no immediate concerns. So why would authorities return again? At that point, there was no allegation, no accusation, only a sense, recorded quietly in internal notes, that certain details did not fully align. Nothing dramatic, just small inconsistencies that were easy to overlook in a city of this scale. London processes millions of financial interactions every day. Most pass without issue. Some, however, invite a second look. Life inside the surrounding streets remained calm. Students walked toward nearby universities. Office workers gathered for coffee before work. In the evenings, lights across the buildings created a familiar pattern, one replicated across countless neighborhoods. From the perspective of the community, nothing suggested that these ordinary routines were connected to anything beyond daily life. Yet authorities are trained to notice repetition. Records indicate that the same addresses appeared in unrelated administrative reviews, months apart. On their own, these appearances meant little. Properties change hands, businesses relocate, people share addresses for convenience. Still, the recurrence prompted a quiet question. Was this coincidence or something more procedural? Financial compliance teams operate largely out of sight. Their work involves cross-referencing data, checking registrations, and confirming that businesses operating in the UK meet basic regulatory standards. In this case, the first point of interest did not come from a dramatic tip-off, but from paperwork. A routine review flagged a money service activity that did not clearly correspond with any registered operator. At the time, the explanation seemed straightforward. Errors happen. Documentation can lag behind reality. Investigators noted the discrepancy and moved on. But several weeks later, a separate review raised a similar query, again linked indirectly to the same cluster of addresses. Why were unrelated checks leading back to the same locations? The city continued its routine. No one was stopped, no doors were knocked, authorities did not intervene. Instead, they observed. Patterns only become visible over time, and London's scale demands patience. A single anomaly rarely means anything. Multiple anomalies, even small ones, begin to form a picture. Officials reviewing the information took care not to draw conclusions. They focused on timelines rather than intent. When were certain activities first noted? How long had they continued? Were there legitimate explanations that had not yet been considered? These questions were documented without speculation. In parallel, financial records showed a volume of transactions passing through informal channels. The amounts were not publicized, and investigators avoided focusing on numbers at this stage. The issue was not scale, but structure. How were these movements being facilitated, and under what authority? Once again, the locations themselves offered no clues. The buildings were not hidden, they were not fortified. Residents nearby described them as quiet, well-maintained, and unremarkable. That ordinariness complicated matters. If something was operating there, it was doing so without disrupting the surrounding environment. Authorities later stated that this was precisely what prompted further attention. Legitimate financial services operating at scale typically leave a visible footprint,
registrations, signage, formal correspondence. Here, that footprint was unclear. Was this simply an administrative oversight, or an example of something functioning outside formal frameworks? The review widened slightly, still within routine boundaries. Analysts compared the addresses against historical data. They noted changes in tenancy that coincided with shifts in financial activity. Again, none of this proved wrongdoing. People move, businesses adapt. But the alignment raised another question. Why did these timelines match so closely? Throughout this period, there was no sense of urgency communicated outside internal teams. No public statements were made, no warnings were issued. The approach remained measured. Investigators were mindful that informal financial practices exist for many legitimate reasons, particularly within migrant communities. The task was to distinguish between lawful cultural practices and regulated services operating without oversight. As weeks passed, a small administrative detail emerged. During a standard compliance request, authorities noted that a business entity associated with one of the addresses had failed to respond within the expected time frame. This was not uncommon, but when followed up, the response provided did not fully answer the questions posed. The inconsistency was minor. It involved wording, not substance. Still, it was logged. Investigators compared it against previous correspondence and found similar ambiguities. Each one, taken alone, meant little. Together, they suggested that the situation warranted closer review. By the end of this phase, authorities had not identified a crime. What they had identified was uncertainty. Records were incomplete, activities were difficult to categorize, and one particular address, ordinary in every visible sense, now appeared repeatedly in files that were never meant to connect. It was at this point that a routine inspection uncovered a detail that could not be easily explained. Documentation indicating financial activity that appeared to continue despite the absence of required registration. It was not proof, but it was enough to raise a new question, and that question would soon require an answer.
It was not proof, but it was enough to raise a new question, and that question would soon require an answer. From that point, authorities adjusted their approach slightly, not by accelerating, but by organizing what they already had. Files that had been separate were brought together. Dates were aligned. Names were reviewed for consistency. What began as an administrative curiosity started to resemble a pattern. Records indicate that the same individuals appeared intermittently across different datasets, often in peripheral roles. None were identified as central figures at this stage. Some were linked through shared contact details, others through overlapping timeframes. These connections were not framed as suspicious, they were simply noted. In a city as interconnected as London, overlap is common. The question was whether this overlap was coincidental or structural. Investigators focused on behavior rather than assumptions. They reviewed how often certain addresses were used for correspondence, how frequently accounts were accessed, and whether activity fluctuated in predictable cycles. In several cases, transactions appeared to pause and resume in ways that aligned with academic calendars and short-term tenancy agreements. Why would financial activity mirror such timelines? Attention also turned to the nature of communication. Authorities stated that correspondence linked to these activities tended to avoid formal channels, favoring informal exchanges that were difficult to verify. This alone was not unlawful. Many small businesses operate informally at first. However, when combined with the absence of registration, it raised another question. Were these activities temporary by design, or was informality serving a different purpose? Individuals connected to the records were considered carefully. Some were students, others recent arrivals to the UK, and some appeared to hold intermediary roles without clear definitions. Investigators avoided labels. Instead, they mapped timelines, when individuals first appeared in records, how long they remained connected, and when their involvement seemed to end. The brevity of some connections stood out. Why did certain names appear only for short periods before being replaced? Authorities also reviewed the geographic spread. While initial attention centered on a small number of properties in East London, subsequent checks revealed links to addresses further west and south of the river. These locations were not clustered tightly, but they shared similar characteristics: short-term leases, limited public-facing activity, and frequent changes in occupancy. Again, none of this was conclusive, but it expanded the scope of review. Financial regulators were consulted as part of routine procedure. Their role was not enforcement, but clarification. Could the observed activity fall within any recognized exemption? Were there lawful explanations that had not yet been considered? The responses were cautious. While informal value transfer systems exist globally, operating them at scale within the UK typically requires registration and oversight. The absence of either remained unresolved. As more information was aligned, a recurring feature emerged. Activity levels appeared resilient. Even when individual participants changed, the overall pattern continued with minimal disruption. Investigators noted this continuity without interpretation. Systems that persist despite personnel changes often indicate organization, but such conclusions were deliberately avoided at this stage. Authorities also examined whether the activity corresponded with legitimate commercial needs. They compared transaction timing with known business cycles. In several instances, there was no clear commercial trigger. Movements did not align with retail seasons, payroll schedules, or invoicing periods. This did not imply illegitimacy, but it reduced the likelihood of certain explanations. Throughout this process, restraint remained central. No interviews were conducted, no warnings were issued. Officials later stated that premature engagement can distort understanding, particularly when dealing with complex financial behavior. Observation, not intervention, defined this phase. Internally, questions became more specific. How were instructions communicated across locations? Why did certain addresses serve as recurring nodes? And why did compliance queries receive partial responses rather than complete clarification? Each question was logged, not as an accusation, but as an unresolved point. One development prompted further discussion. During a routine audit unrelated to the original review, authorities identified a transaction trail that appeared to pass through multiple intermediaries before reaching its destination. The trail itself was not hidden, but it was unusually indirect. When cross-referenced, parts of it intersected with the same network already under quiet review. This intersection did not change the status of the inquiry, but it altered its tone. What had been a narrow administrative concern now touched multiple data sets. Officials recognized that continued fragmentation risked missing the wider picture. Coordination would be necessary. Senior reviewers met to assess next steps. They emphasized that no conclusions had been reached and that lawful explanations remained possible. However, they also acknowledged that the volume of unresolved questions was increasing. At what point does uncertainty justify deeper scrutiny? The decision that followed was measured. Authorities agreed that the matter required closer attention, not because wrongdoing had been established, but because existing processes were no longer sufficient to explain the patterns observed. Formal mechanisms would be needed to ensure clarity, consistency, and accountability as the review continued.
Formal mechanisms brought structure to what had previously been an informal review, and with that structure came a broader view. Once information was shared across departments, similarities that had seemed isolated began to align. Authorities did not describe this as a breakthrough, but rather as an expansion of context. The picture was still incomplete, yet it now extended beyond individual addresses and records. As files were consolidated, it became clear that activity linked to the review was not confined to a single borough or administrative area. References appeared in documentation connected to properties across Greater London, with occasional links to other UK cities. These were not presented as operational hubs, merely points of contact within a wider administrative footprint. The common thread was not location, but consistency in how arrangements were structured. Officials focused on process rather than purpose. They examined how agreements were documented, how access was granted, and how responsibilities appeared to shift between individuals over time. In several instances, records suggested that roles were deliberately narrow, with participants responsible for only one element of a broader arrangement. This compartmentalization, while not unlawful, complicated efforts to understand the full picture through any single perspective. Legal advisors were consulted to ensure that the review remained proportionate. They advised that expanding the scope required clear justification and documented oversight. As a result, each new line of inquiry was logged with reference to existing material. This slowed progress, but it also ensured accountability. Authorities later noted that patience was essential at this stage, particularly where financial behavior intersected with multiple jurisdictions. Information sharing extended beyond domestic agencies. Without detailing methods, officials confirmed that routine international cooperation frameworks were used to clarify whether similar patterns had been observed elsewhere. Responses were cautious and limited, but they reinforced one point. Informal financial arrangements are not unique to the UK, and distinguishing lawful cultural practices from regulated financial activity requires careful assessment. The review also incorporated historical data. Analysts looked back several years to determine whether current patterns represented a recent development or a continuation of earlier behavior. What they found was not a sudden emergence, but gradual growth. Activity appeared modest at first, then increased in scale while retaining the same underlying structure. This raised a practical question. If the framework had remained stable, what had enabled its expansion? Administrative records provided partial answers. Over time, the network appeared to adapt to changes in housing availability, employment patterns, and technology. None of these adaptations were described as sophisticated. Instead, they reflected responsiveness to everyday circumstances. Investigators noted that this adaptability may have contributed to the longevity of the arrangements without attracting attention. At this stage, authorities remained careful in their language. No single element was described as central. Instead, emphasis was placed on interdependence. When one address became inactive, another appeared to assume a similar function. When one individual disengaged, another filled the gap. The continuity of activity rather than the identity of participants became the focus. Meetings between agencies increased in frequency, but remained procedural. Minutes from these sessions show repeated references to clarification, verification, and proportionality. Officials were reminded that expansion did not imply escalation. The objective was understanding, not enforcement, unless evidence required otherwise. One administrative development marked a turning point. During a routine compliance check unrelated to the original review, a regulated institution submitted a report noting unusual consistency in transaction values over extended periods. The report did not allege misconduct, it simply highlighted behavior that did not align with typical customer profiles. When this information was cross-referenced with existing material, overlaps became difficult to ignore. This did not confirm wrongdoing, but it altered the balance of probability. What had previously been explainable through isolated circumstances now appeared across independent sources. Authorities acknowledged internally that the review had moved beyond observation. To proceed responsibly, they would need to determine whether regulatory thresholds had been crossed. The shift was subtle but significant. Oversight bodies were formally notified, and the matter was reclassified to allow for deeper examination under existing legal frameworks. This change did not bring conclusions, but it did change direction. The review was no longer simply about understanding patterns. It was now about establishing whether those patterns required formal intervention under UK law.
That reclassification triggered a carefully controlled escalation, guided less by urgency than by procedure. Once oversight bodies were formally engaged, responsibility shifted from exploratory review to structured assessment. This did not mean immediate action. Instead, it introduced additional layers of authorization, reporting requirements, and review checkpoints designed to ensure that any next steps were justified, lawful, and proportionate. Law enforcement involvement began in a consultative capacity. Officers with experience in financial and regulatory matters were asked to review existing material, not to draw conclusions, but to advise on gaps. Their role was to assess whether the information collected met evidential standards required for further inquiry. Early feedback was cautious. The material suggested coordination, but intent remained unclear. As one internal note later summarized, pattern alone is not proof. To address this, agencies agreed on a phased approach. Rather than expanding outward immediately, they focused inward, testing the reliability of what they already had. Records were re-examined for consistency. Timelines were cross-checked against independent sources. Where individuals appeared in multiple datasets, analysts verified whether those appearances were coincidental or sequential. This process was slow but deliberate. Each confirmation reduced uncertainty. Each discrepancy prompted review. Safeguards were central throughout. Legal teams reviewed proposed actions in advance, ensuring compliance with privacy protections and human rights obligations. Requests for additional information were narrowly defined, limited to what could be justified within existing authority. Senior officers signed off on each step, conscious that procedural errors could undermine any future outcomes. Coordination meetings became more structured. Agencies shared updates through formal channels with clear records of who knew what and when. This transparency served two purposes. It reduced duplication of effort, and it ensured accountability if decisions were later questioned. Participants were reminded that restraint was not weakness, but a requirement of due process. As pressure built procedurally, behavior under review continued largely unchanged. That stability, paradoxically, increased attention. Investigators noted that, despite growing scrutiny in related sectors, the arrangements they were observing showed little sign of adjustment. This raised a practical question. Were those involved unaware of the review, or did they believe their activity fell outside regulatory concern? To explore this, authorities examined points of contact between regulated and unregulated spaces. They looked at how information entered and exited formal systems and whether disclosures matched observed activity. In several cases, declarations were technically accurate but incomplete, omitting context that would have altered interpretation. This was not described as deception, but as selective disclosure, a practice that sits uncomfortably within regulatory expectations. External auditors were brought in to provide independent assessment. Their mandate was limited: evaluate whether existing controls were sufficient given the patterns identified. The auditor's report did not accuse, but it did caution. It noted that while no single control failure was evident, the cumulative effect of small gaps could allow significant activity to pass without scrutiny. This assessment added weight to internal discussions. Authorities now faced a decision point. Continuing observation risked normalizing behavior that might later be judged non-compliant. Acting prematurely risked overreach. The solution, they determined, lay in further corroboration, specifically through documentary evidence that could not be explained by administrative oversight alone. Requests were made for additional records under existing powers. These requests were standard, but their scope reflected the expanded understanding of the network's reach. Responses arrived gradually. Some clarified earlier questions, others introduced new ones. Investigators noted recurring references to arrangements that existed outside formal documentation, acknowledged casually but never fully described.
The pressure, though still procedural, began to be felt. Internal communications show increasing emphasis on timelines and thresholds, not deadlines, but decision points, moments where inaction itself would require justification. Oversight committees asked direct questions about risk, exposure, and public interest. It was during this period that an unexpected factual detail emerged. While reviewing archived correspondence unrelated to the main inquiry, an analyst noticed a reference to a previously overlooked intermediary. This individual appeared briefly in early records, then disappeared from view. When cross-checked against newer material, the same name surfaced again years later, connected to a different set of arrangements. The discovery was not dramatic, but it was consequential. It suggested continuity across what had been assumed to be separate phases. For the first time, investigators could trace a human link bridging the timeline they had been studying. This did not resolve the case, but it challenged earlier assumptions about fragmentation. The network, it appeared, may have been more cohesive than previously believed.
That recognition altered the trajectory of the review in subtle but decisive ways. With continuity established, authorities were now able to frame the matter as a single, extended course of activity, rather than a series of disconnected events. This reframing did not immediately lead to enforcement, but it did change the threshold for action. Records indicate that senior officials agreed the public interest now justified moving beyond observation. Formal inquiries were authorized under existing statutory powers. Notices were issued requesting attendance and clarification from several individuals whose names had appeared repeatedly across the timeline. These steps were administrative in nature, designed to secure explanations and preserve records rather than to assign blame. Nonetheless, they marked a clear transition from review to accountability. Interviews were conducted with legal representation present. The tone remained measured. Questions focused on roles, responsibilities, and decision-making processes, rather than outcomes. In several instances, explanations were provided that aligned with documentation already held. In others, discrepancies remained. Where answers could not be reconciled with the record, investigators noted them for further consideration. As the inquiry progressed, authorities determined that certain matters met the criteria for referral to prosecutors. This decision followed internal review and independent legal advice. It reflected not only the substance of the findings, but also the standard of evidence required for proceedings. Importantly, not all individuals examined were referred. The process differentiated between systemic failure, administrative error, and conduct that warranted judicial assessment. Arrests, where they occurred, were carried out in accordance with established procedures. Authorities later stated that these actions were taken to ensure attendance and prevent interference with evidence, not as a presumption of guilt. Those involved were informed of their rights and released under conditions set by the court, pending further hearings. Court proceedings unfolded over an extended period. The focus was on records, obligations, and compliance with the law. Prosecutors presented timelines and documentation to demonstrate how certain arrangements operated over time. Defense representatives challenged interpretations, offered alternative explanations, and highlighted areas of ambiguity. The court considered these arguments carefully, reflecting the complexity of the case. Judgments, when delivered, were restrained in tone. Where the court found breaches of law, it emphasized accountability rather than condemnation. Sentencing, where applicable, reflected factors such as duration, impact, and cooperation with authorities. In other instances, cases concluded with regulatory penalties or disqualification orders rather than custodial outcomes. The emphasis remained on proportionality. For those affected, consequences extended beyond the courtroom. Professional licenses were reviewed. Organizations implemented changes to governance and oversight. Some individuals withdrew from roles they had held for years.
These outcomes were not framed as punitive alone, but as corrective measures, intended to restore confidence in systems that had been strained. Public statements from authorities were deliberately limited. Officials avoided speculation, noting that the purpose of the process was not to create examples, but to uphold standards. They reiterated that investigations of this nature are evidence-led, and that outcomes depend on what can be proven, not what is suspected. At the same time, the case prompted broader review. Regulators examined whether existing frameworks were adequate to identify similar patterns earlier. Recommendations were issued to improve information sharing and to clarify responsibilities across agencies. These changes were incremental, but they reflected lessons learned from the length and complexity of the inquiry. For the community observing from a distance, the resolution may have seemed understated. There were no sudden revelations or dramatic conclusions. Instead, there was a series of measured decisions, each building on the last. This, authorities suggested, was deliberate. The rule of law operates through process, not spectacle. As proceedings concluded, attention shifted from individuals back to systems. Reports highlighted how small omissions, when repeated over time, can accumulate into significant risk. They also acknowledged the challenge of balancing oversight with fairness, particularly in environments where activity is dispersed and documentation incomplete. The discovery that had reshaped the investigation remained a point of reference. It served as a reminder that understanding often emerges gradually, through persistence rather than urgency. While formal outcomes had been reached, questions about prevention and early detection continued to be discussed within policy circles. In reflecting on the case, one senior official later remarked that its significance lay not in any single decision, but in the demonstration that scrutiny, when applied consistently and lawfully, can bring clarity even to the most complex situations. The process had ended, but the principles it reinforced remained active, guiding future work long after the final rulings were delivered.
Those principles continued to shape discussions long after the formal process had closed, particularly within the communities that had quietly observed events unfold. For many residents and professionals connected indirectly to the case, the aftermath was less about the individuals involved and more about trust in systems, oversight, and the assumption that routine activity is, in fact, routine. In the months that followed, community forums and professional bodies reflected on what had happened with a degree of restraint. There was no widespread sense of alarm, but there was acknowledgement that the case had revealed how easily irregularities can exist alongside everyday normalcy. Ordinary workplaces, familiar streets, and well-established organizations had all formed part of the backdrop. That realization prompted conversations about vigilance without suspicion and accountability without accusation. Authorities reported that the case informed several internal reviews. These did not result in sweeping reforms, but in targeted adjustments. Guidance was updated to clarify reporting thresholds. Training materials were revised to emphasize pattern recognition over isolated incidents. In some sectors, audit schedules were refined to reduce reliance on self-reporting alone. Officials were careful to note that these measures were preventative, not reactive. Awareness also extended beyond institutions. Professional associations circulated summaries of the findings, framed as learning resources rather than warnings. The emphasis was on recognizing when routine explanations no longer fully align with available records, and on the importance of raising questions early, even when answers seem likely to be benign. The case became a reference point in discussions about ethical responsibility and procedural awareness. Despite this, not every question found a clear answer. Some timelines remained incomplete. Certain decisions, while lawful, were never fully explained in public detail due to confidentiality and legal constraints.
Authorities acknowledged these gaps openly, stating that transparency must sometimes be balanced against privacy and due process. They reiterated that the absence of an answer does not imply wrongdoing, only the limits of what can responsibly be disclosed. This measured approach helped prevent speculation from overtaking fact. Media coverage in the aftermath remained limited, reflecting both the complexity of the case and the lack of sensational elements. Where reporting did occur, it focused on institutional learning rather than individual fault. This, observers noted, reduced the risk of misinformation and allowed attention to remain on substantive issues. For those directly affected, the long-term impact varied. Some organizations underwent cultural change, introducing clearer lines of responsibility and documentation. Others found reassurance in the outcome, viewing it as confirmation that oversight mechanisms, while imperfect, ultimately functioned as intended. In both cases, the experience underscored the value of process over assumption. Policy analysts later cited the case in broader discussions about regulatory capacity. It illustrated how modern systems, often stretched across jurisdictions and platforms, require patience to understand fully. Quick conclusions, they argued, can undermine credibility, whereas thorough review, even when slow, strengthens it. This perspective influenced subsequent guidance on interagency cooperation and information sharing. Within the wider community, the case gradually receded from attention. It did not leave behind memorials or public markers, but it did leave an imprint on professional practice. Subtle changes in how records were kept, how anomalies were logged, and how questions were escalated reflected a collective shift toward attentiveness. Looking back, officials involved described the investigation as an exercise in restraint as much as scrutiny. They emphasized that the objective was never to pursue outcomes for their own sake, but to understand whether systems were operating as designed. Where they were not, the response was correction, not condemnation. As years passed, the case came to be referenced less as an event and more as an example. Training sessions mentioned it briefly, illustrating how small discoveries can carry broader significance. New staff encountered it as part of institutional memory, a reminder that diligence often begins with noticing something that does not quite fit. In closing, those reflections returned to the theme that had quietly framed the entire process. What appeared ordinary had deserved a second look, not because it was overtly wrong, but because careful attention revealed layers beneath the surface. Police examined this matter more than once, and in doing so, demonstrated that understanding often emerges not from dramatic moments, but from the patience to look again when the full truth remains just out of view. If you value clear, factual storytelling and responsible true crime documentaries, subscribe to the channel and stay informed with our latest investigations.